For those who might be our guests today, let me just give you a brief explanation of where you find our church this morning. Between Christmas and Good Friday and Easter, we do something as a church family every year. We call it the Jesus season. We put the attention squarely on the person of Jesus. And we do this primarily by reading through one of the Gospels in your Bible about Jesus. This year it happens to be Matthew. And as it happens this year, I am also walking my way through Matthew and teaching about something that you will read this coming week from the pages of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, as it happens, you're aware of this if you're reading through the Gospel of Matthew this year, we are already into Jesus' last week. Now, see, traditionally, Christian people across the globe and across time really only focus on that last week of Jesus' life during what's called Holy Week, the week right before Easter. Well, now you know that in all the Gospels, actually they get way more ink than that. A third of most of your Gospels focus on that last week of Jesus' life, so we're already there. And this week, we are going to pay attention this morning to what you might call Jesus' last words. His last lesson to his followers as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Everything you read this week, Matthew chapter 24 and 25, would fall into that category. We're going to talk about just part of those two chapters. So you have to ask yourself, gosh, I wonder, if I were Jesus and I was about to leave my followers, what would the last thing that I thought they need to know be? I got one shot at telling them one last thing. What would it be? You can imagine it this way. Imagine the world that existed 25 years ago, 30 years ago, without the miracle of the internet. And you're a father, and your recently graduated college-aged daughter says that she's moving overseas. And you're there at the airport for one last coffee or lunch before she gets on the plane. What are you telling her? What are the last words you want her to remember out of your mouth to her? Knowing that after that, really the only way she's ever going to talk to you again is by telephone, maybe by letter. What are you going to say? What words do you want ringing in her ears? That's what you're going to read this week in Matthew 24 and 25. Those last words of Jesus to his followers. This is the part of Jesus' last words to his followers that we're going to talk about today. What you need to know is that he tells two stories that are basically the same thing. One is a short version, one is a long version. This is the long version. The short version you'll also read at the end of Matthew 24. Here's the long version in Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. A fairly well-known story or parable of Jesus. He says, it's as if a man was going to go on a business trip or journey, and he summoned all of his household servants or workers. And he entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. Okay, pause right there. Okay, so this is a decently common Middle Eastern practice in the time of Jesus where a very wealthy landowner or businessman goes away on a business trip and entrusts his local affairs or assets to those in his household servants. Now, what you need to catch, that for those of us 2,000 years later, is the amount of money involved here. A talent is not the English word talent, although our English word comes from that ancient word. That ancient word is a unit of monetary measure. It's not a coin, but it's like when I say a grand, you think $1,000. Okay, well, a talent is like the word grand. It's a monetary measure in the ancient world. How much? The equivalent of 75 pounds of silver. which in Jesus' day was the equivalent of 6,000 denarii. A denarii was the daily wage paid to a common laborer. Okay, so we're getting somewhere. If I use the current federal minimum wage as my guideline for how we calculate a daily wage, then in modern dollars, 1 talent, 175 pound measurement of silver is basically worth approximately $350,000. So one guy got $350,000, one guy got $700,000, and one guy got $2.8 million that were entrusted to them by the household master to his servants. Okay, we're talking about a lot of money. Here's how much money we're talking about. None of Jesus' disciples had ever even dreamed of having that kind of money. Maybe Matthew, the corrupt tax collector, had that much money. Nobody else had ever even thought of having that much money. This is like telling a story and you're using in your story the example of somebody having billions of dollars. You and I are never going to know anybody like that. That's how this story sounded to them. So Jesus says there is a landowner or a businessman who goes away and entrusts copious amounts of money to his servants. The first two, who were given the most talents, invested them and doubled the money from 5 to 10, from 2 to 4. But the one who was given 1 talent, for some reason, went off, merely dug a hole, and hid his master's money, which, by the way, you need to know in that day and time was common practice. There were not strongholds, there were not banks, per se, where common people could put their money. If you wanted to secure your money, one of the ways that people, especially in rural areas or small towns, would do it is they'd bury it where nobody else knew where it was. So this is not an outlandish practice by the guy who has 1 talent. Lo and behold, Jesus says, after a long time, the master of the house comes back. And he asked the guy who was given $2.8 million, hey, what'd you do with it? And that guy said, well, I invested it. I used it well. And it became $5.6 million, 10 talents. To which Jesus says, the master then replied, well done, good and trustworthy servant. You have been trustworthy in a few things. In my world, $2.8 million, not a few things. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of even more or many things, and you will enter into the joy of your master. Same thing happens to the guy who was given 2 talents. Master calls him in, says, what'd you do? I invested it. I multiplied it. It became 4 talents. That $700,000 became $1.4 million. The same exact thing is said by the master to the servant. Well done. You have been trustworthy. I gave you a little. Now you will have much. Enter the joy of your master. And then we get to the guy who dug the hole. The guy with the 1 talent dug the hole. Master calls him in, says, what do you do? He says, well, I know you to be a harsh man. I know you to be, in fact, a thief. That's what he means when he says you take things that are not yours, that you yourself did not plant. This is who I know you to be. Which, by the way, pause, most interpreters would tell you this guy is completely misrepresenting the master. Would a guy who is harsh and a thief entrust that much money to 3 household servants? Probably not. So this guy has a very distorted view of the person who is his employer or household master. It is the reaction of the master that matters most. The complete opposite of what he said to the first 2. You wicked and lazy servant. You knew that some people think that I am this, or I know that you think this about me. If that's the case, then even more you ought to have invested my money, at least with the bankers, so that I could get interest. And then I would have received it and my amount would have gone up. So instead of you keeping the 1 talent I gave to you, we're going to take it from you. And we're going to give it to the guy who had 5 and made 10. And you get to go out into the darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, the opposite of joy. He said to the first 2 guys, enter into the joy of your master. This guy gets the exact opposite. Where he's headed, there is no joy. There is only distress and disappointment. You see it? Now, before we can begin to figure out what it is that Jesus wants us to do with this fairly stark, powerful story that he tells as some of his last words to his followers, we need to ask 2 questions so that we can understand what exactly Jesus means. The first is, who are the people in the story representative of? Who is giving the talents to whom? And then, second, what exactly are the talents? Okay, well, the first one is actually very easy to answer. Because everything you're going to read this week in these 2 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is telling different stories over and over, this being one, where he's the guy going away. So, the master who entrusts the talents to the servants in the story is Jesus. His audience that day are only his disciples, not the big crowds that sometimes gathered around him. So who are the household servants? His disciples. So Jesus is saying to them, I am going away and I am trusting you with something very, very valuable. And someday I will come back and you will be accountable to me for what I have entrusted to you. That's the who in the story. But what are the talents? Now see here, it's very easy to leap to the English word talent. You think, well, what are my talents? If I use that in an English speaker's kind of way. Well, it's my skills, my aptitudes. You sing well, that's a talent. You balance your budget, that's a talent. You're good with kids, that's a talent. Okay, remember, this is not English. What do the talents symbolize in the story? And certainly, by the way, all those things that I just mentioned elsewhere in Scripture, you are accountable to God for. That's not what the meaning is here, however. To understand what the talents are, you have to remember the who in the story. Jesus is about to go away. He is about to entrust something to the disciples while he's away. And someday he will return again, and he will ask them what they did with what he gave them. Which then leads you to ask, what is Jesus leaving his disciples as he prepares to be murdered, resurrected, and then ascend back into heaven? What is it that he gave them? Well, I would suggest to you up on the screen, his disciples that day would have taken what he said in those 2 ways. They were given their experience, their life experience as followers of Jesus, for many of them 3 years, walking where he walked, listening to him, being taught by him, etc. Their spiritual experience of Jesus and what they learned directly from Jesus is what Jesus was entrusting to them, because he was going away and he couldn't do it anymore. He was giving it to them to pass on. And of course, then also the work and ministry of Jesus. The things that Jesus himself had been doing for 3.5 years, up to this last week of his life. Caring for the broken and the marginalized and the poor and the sick. These are things that Jesus himself had been doing. Teaching people his ways. These are the things Jesus had been doing. And now he was leaving, and he was saying to his followers, this I am entrusting to you. So, now, if you know that when you read that story, it's Jesus talking to those like many of us in the room today who are his followers, and you know that the talents being entrusted to his followers are those two kinds of things, now we're set to ask, so what do you think Jesus' point was to his followers then and today in this fairly famous story about the silver talents? What are the takeaways for you and I? What were the takeaways for Peter, James, John, Matthew, and so on 2,000 years ago? What was Jesus' point? Well, here's one to start with, and it's a very positive one in a story that seems to, at least at the end, turn pretty negative. Every single person in the room who calls themselves a follower of Jesus has been entrusted with a lot. Capitalize a lot. Underscore a lot. How do I know that? Because the dude in the story who got the least amount of money got $350K, which is well out of my tax bracket and probably yours, right? Now I want you to think about the disciples who were listening to this. None of those people who were listening to this story had been exposed to Jesus or walking with Jesus or learning from Jesus for more than 3.5 years. For many of us, when we think about somebody who's been a Christian for only 3.5 years, we think they're early in their faith. Well, they're newbies to this. They haven't got it all figured out. Yeah, well, guess what? The guys that Jesus was entrusting the whole shebang to had only been with him for, at most, 3.5 years. At most. See, oftentimes we sell our spiritual experience and learning short. There are lots of people who think that because they haven't been with Jesus a long time, or they spent a long time away from Jesus and have just come back, or they just don't know all the answers to everything, they feel like they don't have a lot to give. Jesus says in this story, everybody who is his follower has been given at minimum the equivalent of $350,000. A lot. I remember very distinctly a conversation I had with someone who was a part of my last church in New Mexico. And this is a guy who grew up in Catholic church, then drifted away, as oftentimes happens to people when he got into his 20s. He got married, had a few kids, became an alcoholic, and woke up someday in his mid-40s and realized, wow, I've kind of made a mess of my life. And through God's kindness, he was able to use our church in New Mexico to reach out to this man, to care for this man, and to bring him back to Jesus' love. And not soon thereafter, maybe a year after he had connected with our church and started walking with Jesus again and being a part of our group, etc., he and I had coffee. And he said, I really don't feel like I have a lot to offer. So many of you know so much more than I do. So many of you have seemed to live lives that are not nearly as scarred as my own. You have not made mistakes like I have. I kind of feel like a second-class citizen. And I was glad to tell him that, you know what, in Jesus' kingdom, there is no such thing. And that in the language of this story, the person in Jesus' kingdom who thinks they know the least or have the least to offer still has $350,000, spiritually speaking, to invest in God's work, in Jesus' work, to pass on to others. There are no paupers in Jesus' kingdom. There are no poor people in Jesus' kingdom. You have been given a lot. What you know, how Jesus has touched you, how Jesus has changed you, how you've seen his truth transform you over time, the work of his that you have been able to do in some part. These are things that he has entrusted to you, and even if you only feel like it's a little bit, in Jesus' eyes, it's a lot. There are no paupers in Jesus' kingdom. So, of course, then the next question becomes, wow, so if really we all have a lot, I wonder what your talents are. Remember, not the English word, in the way they would have been understood in the story. What are your specific talents? How has Jesus impacted you specifically? How has he left his mark on your life? It is not the same for all of us. What are the parts of who Jesus was and what he taught and what he did that resonate the most with you? These are your talents. Now here, I'm glad to say to you this week, this is a subject that you need to do a little more work on because we can hardly cover it on a Sunday morning. On your chairs today are this little half green sheet. There's a very simple reflection exercise that I would suggest you do in writing, where you can work through what your talents are, what Jesus has invested in you, how he has changed you, what you have learned from him, what part of his work you have done in the past that you need to figure out. Because as I'll say to you next, you're accountable for it. So you need to know, what are yours? Do that this week. I'll also pass this around electronically during the week so you can find it that way too. I will tell you there was a story that came to mind when I was working this up this week. I was finishing up my doctorate, and my dad and I, who I'm glad to say is easily the most spiritually significant person in my life, I am fortunate in that regard, caught coffee. This was in New Mexico when I finished it. Finally, I was on the 12-year plan. He and I caught coffee at the only Starbucks in town. Yes, there are towns in America where there's only one. And he and I were talking and whatnot about all different kinds of things. And he was very happy for me that finally the grind of finishing a doctoral degree was ending for me, and then I was going to get more sleep at night, and I wouldn't have to devote myself to this silly 600-page book that nobody reads called a dissertation. But then he paused, and he looked at me, and he said, "You know, son, you're accountable for this." I'm like, "Oh, come on. I just finished it." He goes, "No, listen, man. You're accountable for this. You are now responsible for all this hard work and learning that you've gotten that very few other people even want to do, let alone actually do. What are you going to do with it? It's awesome that you did it. What's next? How will you be responsible for what you've been given?" One of my personal talents, not skill, not aptitude, but one of those ways that I have uniquely been able to learn from Jesus, how he's changed my life, is he gave me this opportunity for 12 years to learn at a very high level, gain all kinds of knowledge that frankly I don't know how to use sometimes. And my dad's right. I owe that to Jesus. I owe that to you. It's one of the talents that he's given me that then I have to turn around and multiply in others. What are your talents? How has Jesus affected you? This is what you need to work on this week. Because of, at the very least, this. Jesus has expectations about your talents. We tend to, in America, have a very one-way, transactional view of our relationship with God. It could be defined like this: gimme, gimme, gimme. As in, God, I am so glad to you that you have given me your grace, your love, your kindness, free of charge and without expectation. It is so great that every time I foul up and make a mistake, if I am willing to walk back to you, you embrace me, like the father in the story of the prodigal son. And all of that is true, except for this part, that he doesn't expect you to do anything with it. What's the message or the point of the story of the silver talents? The exact opposite. Jesus spent 3.5 years of his life investing in a group of dozens, maybe 100 or so followers, teaching them day after day after day, letting them observe him do ministry work, and then entrusting them with the ministry work. Over and over, countless conversations, countless prayers offered, day after day, month after month. And then he said, what are you going to do with it? I expect this to go somewhere. I expect this to expand. I expect this to multiply. When you see me again, I am going to ask you, what have you done with what you've been given? And nothing is not the right answer. In fact, if you remember the story and the way that Jesus unfolds it, nothing is actually the only option that is not possible. What happened in the story? There are two guys who are given all kinds of spiritual investment. They've learned about Jesus. They've heard what Jesus was all about. They've seen Jesus do his work. They may have even tried their hand at it a little bit. And two of the three guys in the story took that and multiplied it. They expanded it exponentially. They added to it. It went forward. Then there's one other guy in the story who was given spiritual experience, transformation, learning, ministry work, etc. And what did he do? He did nothing with it, but he didn't get to keep it. He lost it. There are only two directions in your life spiritually you can go. You can go forward or you can go backward. There is no standing still. If you were a car, you do not have neutral. We can only put it in drive or reverse. Which way are you going? According to the story, here's how you know which way you're headed. What are you doing with what Jesus has entrusted to you? If you, like the first two servants, are actively trying to pass on or give away to others what has been given to you, then you're growing. You're moving. You're pushing ahead. But if your relationship to what you've already been given is passive, if you're just happy to take in and take in and take in, then actually you're not sitting still. You're going backward. And eventually the little you feel like you've been given is going to feel like less and less until you feel completely empty, as if you have nothing. Jesus said that those three servants got to experience two different things. The two who were very active in taking what they'd been given spiritually and passing it on or investing it in others got to experience God's joy, the Master's joy. Who among us doesn't want that feeling, right? I want to feel God's smile. I want to know in my heart that God's proud of me. He's happy with me. Don't you want that too? According to this story, the way you get that is to take what you have, and it's a lot more than you think, and find ways to give it away to the people around you, to your neighbors, to the people of this church, to your kids, to your spouse, to be about Jesus' work. And then you will find God's joy. Here's the way you can't find joy: by keeping it to yourself. According to Jesus, it's a fairly unpleasant experience when you decide to take everything that he's invested in you and just keep it for yourself. He calls it weeping and gnashing of teeth. That does not sound good to me. But you know, I know a lot of frustrated Christian people, spiritually frustrated Christian people. And I wonder if at least this, for some of them, is not at root. What they've decided is that church, their spiritual experience, is about them. And they are going to go to the place with the best music that lifts them up the most, to the guy who can teach the best and inspire them week after week. They're going to go to the small group that is very kind to them and hospitable to them and is willing to serve their needs. And they may do a little thing here or there, but that really defines their Christian experience, their church involvement. You know now from the story what the problem with the flow of their Christian life is. It is all one way, or predominantly so. And I fear for people like that, they will never know the joy of the Master. God's smile, God's happiness, that only comes by taking what you've been given and giving it to others, investing it purposefully in others. Looking at conversations in the week that you have as an opportunity to influence others the way Jesus has influenced you. Teaching in River Kids, not because it's a duty, but because you're investing what Jesus has done for you in the generation to come. And on down the line it goes. You, like me, are accountable for what you've been given. Every week you show up here, every sermon you listen to, every book you read, every blog post you read, every small group meeting you attend, God is giving to you. What will you do with it? Because you are accountable for it, just like I am. I want to wrap up today in which we talked about some of Jesus' last instructions to his followers by introducing you to this guy, David Livingstone. David Livingstone has the notoriety of being probably Europe's most important missionary to Africa in the 1800s. He is somebody who worked to find, for instance, the source of the River Nile, which fascinated Europeans at the time. We know so much about Central Africa because of his work. He actually was the seminal or first person to begin to work with the eastern part of the world, so think the Middle East and India and China, on doing away with slavery. Because even after the Western world, like America and Europe, discontinued slavery, the East did not. And he had a leading hand in advocating for the cessation of slavery in Africa. He died because of his work in Africa. He spent most of his life deathly ill, but yet traipsing all over that large continent for the sake of Jesus' kingdom. Here are two things that we have gleaned from his journals. See if they don't sound like what you heard Jesus say today in the story of the silver talents. He said very simply one time in his journals, all that I am, I owe to Jesus. Now sometimes we might say that kind of thing, and what we mean by that is, wow, God has given me so much, and I am so grateful, which is true. Yeah, but you owe that to Jesus now. What will you do with the you that Jesus is making? What will you do? This is a man who knew that everything in his life, every way that Jesus had touched and transformed him, everything he learned from Jesus, he realized, I owe to him. I have got to do something with this. And then he writes, without Christ, I am not going one step. With him, I'll go anywhere. And then most pertinently to the story that you heard today from Matthew 25, and I will go anywhere so long as it's forward. So long as it's forward. How will you take the talents, the spiritual talents that Jesus has invested in you, and move them forward in your existing relationships this week, in the life of our church, in the life of your coworkers and your neighbors? I know this. Jesus gave you what he's given you, and he will continue to give to you. And he wants you to move forward with it. Take a moment here at the end of the message, and up there on the screen is a very simple prayer that in the quiet you can pray to maybe begin to personalize what you heard today. And I'll give you a moment or two in the quiet to maybe interact with God directly, and then I'll pray for us all.